セッション1は、世界のエシカル消費トップリーダーの皆様により、将来のデジタル消費者に力を与えるデジタルリテラシーのための消費者教育をテーマにディスカッションをしていただきたいと思います。コーディネーターは東京都市大学名誉教授中原秀樹様にお願いいたします。パネリストの皆様は世界各国よりご参加いただいております。ご紹介いたします。イギリスよりエシカルコンシューマー誌編集長のロブ・ハリソン様。オーストラリア連邦よりグッドオンユー代表ゴードン・ルノフ様。アメリカ合衆国よりベターワールドショッパー代表ホーリークロス大学社会学准教授エリス・ジョーンズ博士。フィリピン共和国貿易産業省消費者保護グループ事務次官ルース・ビー・カステロ様。そしてコメンテーターといたしまして一般社団法人日本エシカル推進協議会会長生駒よし子様にお越しいただいております。また本日フランス共和国よりオンラインでご参加をいただく予定でした国連環境計画プログラムオフィサーファリド・イエーカー様につきましては本日ご都合によりご欠席されるというふうに伺っております。それでは中原様よろしくお願いいたします。
はい、それでは国際消費者フォーラム海外のエシカルリーダーの人たちとの、報告最新情報の報告とそしてディスカッションを始めたいと思います。で今冒頭、ご挨拶というか連絡ありましたようにユネップのファリドさん現在グルジアにいるんです。急遽グルジア共和国に行けという話で、国連の仕事ですから、皆さんご存知のように今ウクライナ戦争の問題そして徴兵の問題で、グルジアの方にロシアの若い人たちがどんどん入っているという、非常に緊張した地域であります。昨日まで連絡が取れていて先ほども連絡してたんですけれども、そのリアルの難しさっていうのがですね我々が考える以上にそういう国際的な情勢の中であるんだろうと思います。さてこの国際消費者フォーラムですけれども冒頭知事の方からですね2019年に行われました G20 それのレガシーとして始めたいということでスタートしました。第1回は2020年でこの時にまさかですねコロナがっていう感じがあったんですけれども、それが現実的に例えばロンドンでロックダウンが行われるニューヨークもロックダウンそしてオーストラリアもロックダウン東京もロックダウンということでこれは難しいねということで、早いうちにですね、オンデマンド方式で映像でやりましょうということを考えました。でその時のテーマはですねいわゆる世界的なパンデミックの中でどうコロナがこのエシカルな消費に影響を与えたのかっていうことをテーマにして議論をさせていただきました。そして翌年もうこの頃にはなんとかなるんだろうと思ってたのが全く当てが外れてですね第2回目の国際消費者フォーラムもできなかった。しかし未来志向ではありませんけれどもアフターコロナを見据えて我々は何ができるのかそしてその時にデジタルというツールをですね私たちが活用することによってリアルでお会いできないけれどもそのための対策ができるんじゃないかということでそういうテーマで第2回目を行いました。で こでちょっとパワーポイントを出していただきたいんですけれども、グローバルリスク2022ということで、皆さんダボス会議で、皆さんこのワールドエコノミックフォーラムご存知だと思いますけど、毎年年の初めにですね、世界はこういうリスクに見舞われる可能性があるというのを、もう20年近くチェックをしているわけですけれども、これが今年のいわゆるグローバルリスクなんですね。もうあと2ヶ月ちょっとでですね、今年は終わるんですけど、さあ皆さんこの結果に対してですね、当たってるのか当たってないのか、果たして当たっていいのかどうなのかということもお考えいただきたいと、こういうのが出ております。私は個人的にはですね、2021年というのがこの2022年を占う年であったと考えております。すなわち何なのかといいますと、一つは 9.11 から20年経った。そして私たち日本人にとっては忘れることのできない 3.11 から10年。そしてコロナのパンデミックを予見させるスペイン風邪が起きてから100年なんですね。で、そういう意味では歴史の転換点にあるんだろうと。だからこそこの2022年っていうのはどうなっていくのかっていう、いい方向に進もうとしているのか、それともとんでもない方向に進んでいるのかっていうことを占うきっかけの年だろうと思います。で、そういう中で、2019年に行われました G20 にも参加いただいた、国際的な消費者運動のプラットフォームを持っていますコンシューマーインターナショナルのヘレナさんに、実は問題提起をしてほしいということをお願いしました。で、今その彼女からのビデオメッセージを受け取ったと思いますけれども、この中で2つの大きな視点があった。で、一つは気候変動とプラスチック問題で、特にプラスチックの問題っていうのは我々は便利だからということで使ってきたのがですね、とんでもないいろんな問題を引き起こしていると。もうこれも待ったなしで対応せざるを得ないというところまで来ています。2つ目が、私はクレジットカードを想像したんですけど、これはもう古すぎる話でですね、今やスマホ決済という形です。もしくは私たちの生活に必要なさまざまなものがデジタル化しようとしている。さあ、お便利だからということで使っていっていいのか、それともヘレナさんが指摘したようにサステナブル、持続可能な選択を消費者は持ってるんだということからすれば、その選択の余地がこれからのデジタル社会に本当にあるのかどうなのかということを考える。で、そういう話をですね、実は、このスピーカーの方々の話の後にですね、ツールはトラップという形でですね、本当に役に立つ道具なのか、それとももしかして落とし穴があるのかというディスカッションをしていきたいと思います。それではまず最初にですね、ロブ・ハリソンさんから報告をいただきたいと思います。ではロブさん、よろしくお願いします。
Hi, good morning, everybody. It's very good to be here in person. I was presenting at the last two forums in Tokushima from my bedroom in Manchester in England. So it is a very different feeling to be here today now. I have some slides. I wonder if we could see the first one. So I'm not really presenting any answers. I'm setting the scene this morning, and I am asking what do we know about Generation Z and ethical consumption, and what do we know about the role that DX, digital transformation, is already playing in the role of ethical consumption. So I'll see what we know so that we have some grounds to discuss later on. Just a bit of background about myself. If you don't know, Ethical Consumer is a UK-based organisation that provides buying information to ordinary consumers about products and ethical products. And here we can see on the left it's a buyer's guide to electric cars. In the middle is a buyer's guide to fair trade coffee, and another one looking at chemicals in clothing. So we look at ethical issues, and people buy the magazine, and they've been doing it for 30 years now. And that's one of the main things we do at Ethical Consumer, provide information to consumers on ethical issues. So I have there are six issues, themes that I'm going to talk about. I think I have 12 minutes now that we don't have so I will try and keep to 12 minutes. So I'm going to look at survey data, particularly about what's new since the pandemic and Ukraine war. What has that done to change ethical consumption around the world? Then looking at whether we know anything from survey data about Generation Z particularly. So a little bit about young people on activism and ethics and the green transition. Then a little bit on how digital transformation crosses over with consumers. Then ethical consumption and the role of formal education, which I know is a subject close to the hearts of Tokushima. And then some difficult questions to end on, because it's always good to have questions and not always answers. So I hope I can get through all that quite quickly. There's a lot to say there. So this first slide is one that I had last year, actually. So it was but it's quite good. It's just from consumers in Europe, but it's asking them about the pandemic and were they more likely to be ethical consumers since the pandemic or not? And the answer is yes, for most people. It has driven a growth in ethical consumer behaviours, definitely in Europe, that we have been able to observe. And not only that, we've seen companies respond very quickly too, and they're beginning to try and sell more products to consumers, far more than there ever were before the pandemic. We hit the problem of greenwashing, which we're going to talk about later when that happens. But we've seen a big growth in interest in ethical consumption since the pandemic. However, this year, as we know, there's been a war in Ukraine. This has seen prices of consumer products go up by a lot. In the United Kingdom, the price of energy has increased by 400%, the price of food by 10%. And this was a survey. So lots of newspapers think no one will buy ethical products now because they're so expensive. Now everyone has to pay for their energy bills. They won't buy ethical products. So we did this survey in August with UK adults. And it seems that the most people say that they're not going to change. Just because things get more expensive doesn't mean they're going to stop being ethical, which is interesting, really, because, well, we understand that ethical choice is not quite the same as buying a different flavour of tea. You know, it has something deeper than that. So we think it's more sticky, and it's not going to be thrown aside just because of a cost of living crisis. And the other thing that we did in the survey was we asked about changes that people had made to their behaviour since the cost of living crisis that also happened to be good for sustainable consumption. And there is quite a lot of changes here. All things that we are tracking in reducing carbon emissions of consumption that have happened as a result of the cost of living crisis, not necessarily because people want to be ethical, but because they have to do this because the heating is expensive and the other choices and other consumer goods are available to them, which is it raises a really interesting point about the intersection between having money and being sustainable and how they relate. But we haven't time to do all of that now. So this is not survey data, this is market data. So it's more accurate, if you like. And this is something that we do in the UK, just looking at the ethical food market, this data set. And it showed growth of 10%. It's not the 30% perhaps that consumers were claiming, but still quite significant growth in the pandemic period when the economy wasn't growing that fast. So we are still seeing strong growth in ethical buying. This is organic and fair trade and other types of ethical food. So my next section now is just what surveys can tell us about Generation Z. And there aren't very many surveys because they don't always ask about Generation Z, they ask about young people. But this one very specifically asks a question about, you know, are you interested in changing your lifestyle? And we can see that the second one down on the right-hand column of green things says 56%. So Generation Z, it kind of is up there amongst the highest respondents of interested in sustainable consumption in this survey. This is an interesting survey, GlobeScan. They survey across 5 continents, so there's Asian and American and European consumers in this survey. And it comes to the conclusion that we see more interest in Generation Z. And I think that's reflected. They asked the next question about what changes have you actually done, and Generation Z hasn't done as many changes as it would like to. But by and large, that is consistent with other information that we have around Generation Z, is that they are more concerned about ethical issues, social issues, climate issues than perhaps the previous generation. And again, this is from the same survey actually, and it shows that the younger people are the darker blue, and so actually, you know, that when it comes to taking action, it looks like the older generations are doing more at the moment, and we can maybe explore why that might be later on. There are lots of ideas as to why that might be a question. Not all of them, but some of them. I think a final slide on the Generation Z is that they have quite a lot of interest in diet, changing diet away from meat. This is a Forbes article from the US, going 79% of Generation Zs being eager to go meatless a few times a week. So there is definitely a trend. This is globally. We see this in pretty much every market that we look at. It's around meat and dairy consumption, particularly because of the climate impacts. But it's not stopping altogether, it's just reducing generally, and this is a trend we see in Generation Z. So these are what the surveys tell us. The other thing that we just wanted to point out is that this generation, the Generation Z that we're talking about, also has developed a reputation as being more politically active than the previous generations. Very much that, you know, this is a picture of the school strike, which you will maybe have heard of, and at the bottom it says 7,500 cities around the world took part in simultaneous actions to not go to school on a Friday and to complain about the climate. And, you know, we saw, you know, on the slide that Professor Nakahara showed this morning, the failure to act on the climate crisis was the #1 concern at the World Economic Forum, but it's the #1 concern of young people as well, so much that they stopped going to school in 7,500 cities. This is just a second slide on the activism there, and these are some of the groups, there are groups around the world where young people have got together to be active. The one Teach for the Future in the right is a UK one, which is interesting, but it's a students' campaign to say, we want you to teach us about climate in the school. We want it to be part of the formal education program. And that's interesting here at Tokushima, because we're talking about formal education later, and we can see that the activists of the young people are going, teach us, please, tell us this stuff. So that's the bit on what we know about Generation Z. Just a little bit about DX and what it's doing in consumer markets around sustainability. Smart meters and controls, very big in the UK, and particularly since the energy prices have gone up by 400%. People are getting smart meters faster than ever before, not least to try and manage their costs. The other thing that we know is that digital transformation is helping, you know, consumers make choices in markets. And down the bottom we have a picture of what Gordon is going to talk about later, his own project, Good On You. In the middle is a project that we are working with at Ethical Consumer with T-Point, T-Card in Japan to create a standards for sustainable food, so that when people buy sustainable food products using their and using their T cards, they gain points, if you like, for sustainable food. So you can watch your own points go up with sustainable food. So that's a project that we have going in Japan. So it isn't just buying. So the digital transformation has really helped consumers sell stuff too. And this is really important for the circular economy. One of the things that we talked about, one of the things on the slides earlier, it's absolutely critical that the number of products in circulation goes down. And one of the ways of doing this is by people not throwing them away and for their use to go on. And we found very much in the last 2 years particularly, the quality of information in these digital sales has gone up tremendously. They're nearly as good as Amazon now. You can get a lot of information about the product, the carbon you'll save, how good it's going to work, it's been tested, and all this kind of stuff. So there's much more quality going into the selling, which is a vital point of sustainable consumption. So finally, there's a couple of slides here on collaboration. So this is the other thing that it allows consumers to do. It allows them to collaborate in markets. This is the one on the left is called Fairbnb. It's like Airbnb, but better. We haven't got time to go into that, but these are some of the other things like Depop clothing apps that allow people to more than just buy and sell. They're having conversations and they're doing other stuff and making plans. So there's collaboration going on that can help us get to sustainable consumption going through digital transformation too. And finally, the activism that I spoke about earlier, about the school strikes and the climate activism, is also using digital transformation to help the activism work. So again, we can see Avaaz, which people will probably know about, and so these are examples of how the digital transformation is helping the activism. Nearly there now, just a couple of things. The formal education now still has a role to play. And we know, and this is why I'm excited to come to Tokushima, because I think there are really interesting things happening here around formal education, and I want to learn about them. But we know that it's, sustainable consumption in education is now, it's becoming much more practiced around the world. They don't always call it ethical. It's usually called sustainable consumption. And this is UNEP here. I've been surveying it a few times. And in my own ethical purchasing handbook in the middle, I say that all education systems should educate on ethical and sustainable consumption from an early age, because consumers are starting earlier and earlier. And if they do not know, the system will not work. It is a bit like you see what happens with democracies if people aren't educated how to work with a democracy. It's the same way with a market. If you don't educate people how to work with a market, it can go wrong. It requires training and teaching. There we go, and this is my slide on Tokushima, which we'll all talk about later, but it's begun to be, we hear about it in the English language press now. It's made it round to the other side of the world. So just my last slides are just around the difficult issues, some of the things, not everything is straightforward in ethical consumption or indeed sustainable consumption. And so my first question, if there's not enough formal education in ethical consumption, how do Generation Z activists know how to campaign about it? So we can see them campaigning, but they don't have education. So they're getting information from somewhere. It's probably from the digital transformation, it's from the internet. But we know that there are problems with information quality on the internet. I think we would put it that way. And there's a little image there of a climate change denying site on the internet. So that's probably one of the reasons why formal education can be better. Difficult issues. I mean, the other thing is that all digital transformation isn't necessarily good. This is an obvious statement. I've put a big picture of Uber there. We've also got Facebook and some of the social problems that have come from the use of Facebook, and artificial intelligence as well. I won't go into the detail of it there. This is my penultimate slide, which is always, I like to finish on something optimistic. And this is from research, the same piece of research that was looking at Generation Z. It says, despite the significant challenges that society is facing today, 61% of next generation respondents under the age of 30 believe our children and grandchildren will have a higher quality of life than we do today, compared to 54% of respondents over the age of 30. I would just reflect on that it doesn't necessarily say that they think we'll have a higher income. They think we'll have a higher quality of life. But I think that's still a cause of some optimism. So just to recap what I've said, I talked about the pandemic and Ukraine and what that had, the impact that had on growing ethical consumption. I looked at the survey data that told us that young people, particularly Generation Z, surveyed particularly high in interest around ethical consumption and climate. Particularly, I saw how they were involved in activism already around this issue, which kind of tells us another thing, that as well as formal education telling younger generations how to behave, we can also listen to younger generations who can tell us how to behave as well, because I think they have it's not a one-way journey, if you like, that contribution. Finally, the role of formal education, digital transformation and consumers. We talked about some of the things that are happening, and I threw some difficult questions in there to make the day exciting. And that's my website and the book, and I've finished. Thank you very much.
どうもロブさんありがとうございました。まさにヘレナが言ってた Take Action どうやって行動するのか、でそのために消費者教育どういう役に立つのか、Z 世代に焦点を合わせた、大変素晴らしい、報告をいただいたと思います。でその報告の中でエマ・ワトソンの、スマホの絵が出ておりましたけれども、次はゴードン・ルノフさん、グリーントランジッションにおける消費者の選択が果たす役割、サステナブルファッションの問題点ということで、報告をいただきます。よろしくお願いします。
Minasan, konnichiwa. Thank you very much for all participating in this forum. It's a very important topic, and I'm very grateful for you all here present today and online to participate in these discussions. And I'm personally very delighted to be here, and I'm very grateful to the leadership of the Tokushima Prefecture and the Consumer Policy Division for inviting me, and for Professor Nakahara to chair this session and have us along again after the online experiences of the last 2 years. So here's what I'm going to talk about. 3 things. A little bit about consumers and the green transition. A lot of what I want to say here is very similar to the material that Helen Laurent from Consumers International presented us with earlier, and some of the things that Rob has been saying. Indeed, this is a good time for me to acknowledge Rob. My background is in consumer organisations. I used to work for members of Consumers International, and indeed was on the Council of Consumers International at one time. And when I left those organisations, I was inspired to work exclusively in sustainable consumption. And Rob's organisation, Ethical Consumers UK, along with an organisation in the US that no longer exists called The Good Guide, were probably 2 of the inspirations for the work that we've been doing in the last 10 years. So I'll go through that part quite quickly because it's been covered a bit already. And then I want to focus on what are the strategic policy responses that we should take, and including that governments should take, to support consumers play their role in the green transition. And then I'll spend a little bit of time talking about how Good On You tries to also support consumers to make better and more sustainable consumer choices. So, firstly, consumers and the green transition. There's no doubt that consumer actions and consumer choices are key drivers of unsustainable consumption. Nearly everything that all consumer choices impact on what we produce in the world. They directly influence businesses and the businesses that supply those businesses. And really, the only other drivers of unsustainable consumption are government decisions, because what business does is provide services to consumers and to government. And so consumers have a really important role to play. And this is one of my key points. Consumer agency is essential to the green transition. And this is widely recognised. We can see here statements from the OECD 14 years ago, from Consumers International just this year, and there are many more recognitions of consumers' role. And of course, these are fully consistent with SDG 12, the Sustainable Development Goal 12, which asks us to look for sustainable systems of consumption and production. Just checking how my time is going. So it's important to think of consumer decisions as part of the solution to unsustainable consumption, not as the cause of the problem. If we want consumers to play a strong role, we must not focus on consumers making the bad choices. We must focus on their desire to do better, and we must explore how we can empower consumers to do better. We need to acknowledge that a majority of consumers want to make sustainable choices, but we also need to acknowledge the context in which they make those choices. They don't want to buy sustainable goods. They want to buy goods or services that meet their needs, and they also want them to be sustainable. And then we can look at the barriers, what is actually stopping them make sustainable choices. And we can look at things like, I'm just going to skip ahead to this slide. I have to go a long way back. Oopsie, sorry. Seems to have disappeared. Oh well, we'll go back to where we are. Sorry about that. The barriers that they're facing, which include things like lack of information, lack of products that meet their needs, lack of awareness of issues. So the important point here is that consumers have a right to consume sustainably. We must not think about consumers being responsible for the problem. We must think of them as being the potential solution and as having a right to consume sustainably. And what that means, and this is the key point, what that means is that producers of goods and services have an obligation to be transparent. They have an obligation to tell us what we need to make decisions that align with our values. And jumping ahead to the policy response, the key activity of government needs to be, there's a couple, but one of the key activities for government needs to be supporting consumers to make sustainable choices by addressing the barriers, and one of those is businesses being transparent about how their production practices impact on the values we hold dear, including sustainability. There's a lot of opportunity in solving that number one problem around climate change that Professor Nakahara talked about if we empower consumers. The IPCC, and Helen Laurent has already mentioned this, the IPCC report suggests that socio-cultural and behavioural change issues for consumers are a key opportunity to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And we've talked a lot about how the role of digital consumption in this transformation. We know that digital shopping is around about 20% of all consumption globally. It varies a lot by sector. Some services, it's almost 100%, like buying airline tickets. Other things like food, it's much less. Clothing, where I have the most expertise, is around 20%, same as the average for all things. And we know it's growing much faster than total growth, but it will take a long time, if ever, before digital shopping exceeds in-store shopping. But consumers inform themselves before going into store with digital means. So the digital economy affects a lot more than just the 20% that is e-commerce. We talked before about consumers being motivated to make consumer choices. I think it's a really important thing to bear in mind here. One is that we see a lot of surveys where where people like Globescan will report that 60, 70, 80% of consumers want to make sustainable choices, and but what we don't see is 60%, 70% of actual consumer choices being sustainable. So there's a big gap between what consumers say they want to do and what consumers actually do. And one response to that is to say, oh, consumers are hopeless, we can't trust them. But another response is to say, what's really going on here? And there are two important things. One, I believe those surveys overstate consumer motivation a bit, which is why I've got this slide here, which suggests that if you look at consumers' underlying values and their actual behaviours, then we can be confident that around 50% of consumers really care enough to make a change in their shopping. And that some people are just saying they want to support sustainable consumption because it's an easy thing to say in a survey. But still, 50% is a lot, and we can work with that. And then I think the second thing we need to understand, as I said before, is we don't make consumer choices in a vacuum, so we don't make sustainable choices in a vacuum. We make choices to solve a particular problem that we have. We need clothes to wear to work. We need transportation to get us somewhere. We need food to eat. And the food has to meet our other desires too, our price point, our tastes, and so same with the clothes, same with the transport. So really quickly, clothing is a significant industry. There's some data here that you can read. I'm going to skip through this slide. Clothing has a lot of impacts on the environment, as I'm sure you're aware. Some of them are listed here. But I want to spend a bit of time on the strategic policy responses. So we have a number of policy challenges if we want to help consumers do better. And so the first of those that I want to point out is that most brands are not transparent. There are a very small number of brands which will tell you everything about how they make their goods, what those impacts are. They'll have measured their climate change emissions. They'll have very clear knowledge of how their workers are treated, etc., etc. The second one is that brands know that sustainability sells. Brands know that there is an increasing consumer interest in these issues. Brands know that if they tell consumers that they're sustainable, they're more likely to make a sale. But they're not always telling the truth. The research by the regulators around the world in 2021, sorry, that's an error, it's 2021, not 2020, showed that the government authorities estimated that about 50% of claims that they identified were not supported by evidence. So that's a problem, and it's a problem, as I'll tell you in a minute, could steer us off course, but it's a problem we have to talk about. And then finally, there are certain unacceptable practices, wasteful models of business and harmful chemicals and many, many other things, and perhaps they can be regulated out of existence, but we can't solve all the problems with regulation. So the policy response, we must empower consumers, we must prohibit the worst practices, and we must incentivise better practice. But if we go back to empowering consumers, I think it's really important, most important thing I'm saying today is that policy response must require transparency. We must support robust information services that give consumers this information. Yes, we have to combat greenwashing, we have to combat misleading conduct, but my concern is that if we combat misleading conduct in the wrong way, we will disincentivise businesses to say anything about their production and will undermine the more important goal of requiring transparency. This is some examples of legislation that impact on this area. You can see it's very diverse. A lot of it requires consumers to act. When you require disclosure, you're basically expecting consumers to act on that legislation. I don't have time to go through this in detail. Really quickly, just on Good On You. We know, as I said before, that about 50% of consumers want to shop more sustainably, but it's too hard to know which products and which brands are in fact more sustainable, particularly in a complex market like clothing, where you have literally millions of choices in the world about which particular clothing item you could buy, and probably hundreds of thousands of brands that you could buy from. So our vision is a world where anyone can know the true impact of a product as easily as you know the price. So you can know the climate change emissions, you can know the overall rating, you can know whether they pay their workers properly, as easy as knowing the price. We want to achieve that world. We've made a very small step in that direction by creating Good On You, which at the moment rates fashion brands for their impact on people, on the planet and on animals. And we bring a lot of, up to 1,000 different data points down to a score out of 5. So this is some more information on how we do that, which I'll skip over because of time. And then finally, we believe that by empowering consumers to choose better, we can ask brands to do better. We can create incentives, financial things that brands really understand, like how they're going to make money, incentives to do better, and that will lead to them improving their practices because we'll have a regime of transparency and will have good action against greenwashing, and that will lead to the positive social and environmental impact that we all want to power a just and fair green transition. And thank you very much. You can find more information at goodonyou.eco.
Thank you. 大変興味のある発表でした。で、特にグリーンウォッシュの問題ですね、50% 近くがですね、これはまずいぞと、本当のことを伝えてないということがあります。さあ、日本の企業はどうなんでしょうか。そういうことを考えざるを得ない。まさに次の発表をいただくグッショッパーのエリス博士、お話しいただくテーマは、デジタルグローバル市民と、より持続可能な社会を創造するための技術の活用ということで発表をお願いしたいです。よろしく。
Thank you for having me. A special thank you to Professor Nakahara, the organizers of the Tokushima Conference, and for all of you in attendance today. My name is Ellis Jones. I'm the founder of Better World Shopper and an associate professor of sociology. Today I'll be talking about how ethical consumption fits in a larger context of digital global citizenship. And what I've done is organize this talk in 3 sections. The first being a look at my research for the past 20 years as a kind of exploration of the past, how I've gotten here today, and then a bit of time focused just on the present and what my current work says about digital global citizens, and finally a look to the future for the next 20 years or so, where my work hopes to reach. So just a little bit of background. A simple definition of ethical consumerism is the examination of the collective behavior of consumers who are attempting to participate in the solutions to global social and environmental problems using their economic power. Now, the biggest obstacle to this, as was mentioned earlier, is something called greenwashing. And this is simply a practice that has now become incredibly common, where corporations and other institutions attempt to claim sustainability already, when in fact they are still working on it, and many of them have different track records of sustainability. So the question becomes, how do we help ethical consumers navigate around this greenwashing so that they can support those companies and institutions that are actually sustainable? And of all of the solutions that I've looked at, I think the most effective are these sustainability rating systems, very much like the one I've started in the US, Better World Shopper, also that Rob has started in the UK, working with Ethical Consumer, and even Gordon in Australia. These all are different types of sustainable rating systems. So for my own system in the US, what I did was look at 5 common values that consumers had expressed being important to them over the years, including human rights, the environment, animal protection, community involvement, and social justice. It turns out I did a research project later in which I compared many of these systems all over the world, and strikingly, almost all of these systems have the same set of values. And then I looked at all of the publicly available data over the last 30 years and translated this data across 75 consumer categories into A to F rankings. Now, in the US, it makes sense to have A to F rankings because everyone has participated in the school system in the US, and so they've all been graded from A to F in the school system, and thus everybody knows what an A means and what a B and a C and so forth. So when they see these rankings, they have a good sense of what it means for a company to get an A or a B or a C. The research itself originally stemmed from another book that I had written in graduate school, trying to catalog all of the ways that individuals can attempt to contribute to the solution for global social and environmental problems. And out of this 400-page book, there were just a few pages on ethical consumption, a few pages on shopping. All of the responses from the book came back to those few pages. And that's what started my own research in ethical consumption, because the readers themselves pointed me to that. This project has now gone on for just over 20 years, and there are now 7 editions of the book. And that gets us to the present day. Now I am looking at this project of ethical consumption in a larger context of global citizenship, and specifically digital global citizenship, which I believe has 4 cornerstones: economic, social, political, and ecological or environmental. What the translation from global citizenship to digital global citizenship offers us are, I think, 4 things: greater transparency, which has been talked about before, and allows us to see these institutions that we are creating and participating in a clearer light; extending democracies, so broadening and deepening our democratic participation in these institutions. It allows for an increased level of engagement as people become tied into the digital world on a daily basis, on an hourly basis, and minute by minute. And finally, it allows us to transmit more effectively the practical translation of the data that will help individuals build trust with us and each other over time. So I started this process quite simply with the first app for smartphones that was a translation of the ethical consumerism research that I had done earlier. And this is, in a sense, the digital tool for consumers to practice their economic power by using those grades on a daily basis to help sustainable companies move forward. Then what I did was I took the same framework that I used to grade companies, and with the help of my students, I took that framework and applied it to the American political system. And the result was an app called Voter Glass. And what it did was, or what it does to this day, is it rates politicians, American politicians, not from whether they're liberal or conservative, or they're from the Republican or Democratic Party, but rather how honest they're being with the American people. It uses publicly available data about fact-checking public statements that these politicians have made, and it is a way for individuals to help support those politicians that are the most honest or have the best track record of honesty with the public. For the social aspect of global citizenship, as a sociologist, I know that the conversations we have about the world inform the way we behave and act in the world and how we think about the world. So these social conversations are increasingly driven by the kind of media we consume, both mainstream media and social media. So for this tool, what I had my students and I look at are the news outlets that Americans consume their news from, both the more mainstream news outlets, but also social media outlets. And I had them rate from A to F using the same system, essentially, that I use for ethical consumption: overall reliability, integrity, neutrality, independence, and ultimately how fact-based the news is. And this allows consumers, news consumers, to then support those media that are most transparent with the public. So, digital global citizens, yes, they must be ethical consumers or sustainable consumers, but they also must be responsible news consumers. And they also must be well-informed voters. And they also must be making sustainable life choices. This is the only app that I have not gotten to. It's on my to-do list to make an app or a tool just for environmental citizenship as well. This brings me to the third phase, looking toward the future. Where do we go with this idea of digital global citizenship now that we've begun to build small tools in this area? I think the future outlook needs to be driven by a need to both broaden and deepen our democratic institutions over time. So let me give you an example of what that looks like. Since my background is in ethical consumption, so the economic aspect of this global citizenship, let's start there. So for sustainable rating systems, what it would mean is to broaden this democratic institution, we would need a global sustainable rating system, one for the whole planet, that anyone could access anywhere at any time. In addition, we need national rating systems that are tailored to the population of each country so that consumers in different countries also have access to the rating system that is produced just for their country. We then need local options for rating systems. So every state or province or prefecture or even city would create, for example, maps of those areas to allow consumers to then go out and support those businesses and those avenues for sustainable consumption. Deepening this democratic institution looks a bit different. Instead of providing a wider range of options, what I'm talking about here is allowing for a deeper involvement in the project itself. So for individuals, for example, looking for ways that they can track their own ethical spending on a week-by-week or on a month-by-month basis or even yearly. Now, we already have apps like this that people use for budgets, for when they want to budget their own monies in a particular way. We also have apps like this for exercise so that people can track their overall exercise. We need this same model to be placed with ethical consumption so that we can see if we are improving over time, and if so, why. Then we need to translate that model for institutions so that businesses can track their own ethical and sustainable spending so that non-governmental organizations can do the same. And even nation states ultimately need to be able to track questions like, for example, on a year-to-year basis, how many sustainable, low sustainability or medium sustainability or high sustainability companies are we producing, so that each nation can begin to look at and compare and understand what is leading to that creation process. Now, this same model needs to be applied creatively to the other aspects of global citizenship. The social aspect involved with media, the political aspect, and the ecological aspect. But that will take a little more creative thought and perhaps a bit more help from the next generation. So in sum, we have the beginnings of an ethical consumption movement now, and that is incredibly important. But it is not enough. We need to then put that into the larger context of digital global citizenship and begin to build the tools that allow us to make that a reality. And then finally, we need to take those tools and broaden and deepen the democratic institutions that we have worldwide that support us. If you'd like to read more about these ideas, there's a bevy of resources online that you're welcome to look at. I'd like to thank you for the important work you are doing here. It is meaningful, it is practical, and it is incredibly important for the next generation. ありがとうございます。
はい、どうもありがとうございました。日本の国内の中ではコンシューマーシチズンシップという消費者市民なんていう、訳語が与えられてますけれども、もう次のステップに入っている。それがデジタルグローバル市民という考え方、国境を越えていろんな意思決定判断が行われていると、特にアメリカの中で大きな問題になったのはトランプ政権選挙の時にいわゆるケンブリッジアナリティカがやったフェイスブックの、世論操作の問題、そしてさらにはイギリスの中でブレジットが行われた EU からの離脱の問題でやはり このケンブリッジアナリティカが世論操作を行ったということが今でも問題になっているわけであります。でそういう意味で考えると、このデジタルグローバル市民への対応、単なる成人年齢の引き下げの問題ではなく、本当に現実社会の中でどう Z 世代が対応していったらいいのか、その準備が今求められているのではないのかという、大変、素晴らしい発表であったと思います。さあ、そういう中でジョージアにいる、グルジアにいるファリッドさんはかわいそうなことに、日本に来れなくなっちゃったんですけど、というかオンラインでできなくなったんですけれども、最後の発表者、フィリピンの Z 世代への持続可能な消費の提唱ということで、ルスさん、よろしくお願いいたします。
Konnichiwa. Yes, it's a pleasure to be here and be back, actually. I'd like to thank Dr. Hideki Nakahara, of course, and the organizers of this event. We have actually been present. We were at the G20 here in 2019, and then our good friends here were also part of the 2020 and the 2021 Tokushima Consumer Conference. So it's good to be back here and to see all of you physically. I am actually among the 5 panelists here, or the 4 panelists, I'm the only one that represents government. I am Ruth Castello. I am the Undersecretary or the Vice Minister in Japan of the Department of Trade and Industry Consumer Protection Group. So my view in my presentation would be coming from the point of view of government as a regulator and as a consumer protector. We all understand, in the Philippines, we always say that consumer protection is a shared responsibility. It's not just government that can do it, but we need the support and the cooperation of all consumers so that we will all be able to provide the protection that they need and the enhancement of their rights, as well as the performance of their responsibilities. And so let me begin. My presentation will be on sustainable consumption and production in the Philippines and how we influence the Filipino youth. This will be the content of my presentation. The first part will be our vision for a sustainable society, and then all our educational initiatives. We will then mention the challenges that we face along the way. And of course, we have ways forward. There are a lot of things in our minds as part of government that we should do. But of course, we cannot do it all at the same time. We will have to do it one by one. The shared vision for the Philippines, as included in the Philippine Action Plan for Sustainable Consumption, is to have, by 2040, we will all have a comfortable, strongly rooted, and a secure life. This is part of the Ambition 2040. Ambition means ambition, and this is the ambition of the Philippines in 2040, but we also have included and already institutionalized in the Philippine Action Plan. You will see the sustainable consumption and production. Like I mentioned earlier, we have started institutionalizing this, and we have priority actions, of course. This will facilitate and contribute to achieving our Ambition 2040. And when this is realized, Filipinos will consume and produce green goods and services and shift towards sustainable and climate-smart practices and lifestyle. This is kind of lengthy, and I have only 10 minutes to make the presentation. So I will skip the Philippine Action Plan, but I'd like to emphasize that this is being institutionalized already in the Philippines. We have a lot of laws involving environmental protection, actions towards climate change that we have all been implementing. And I forgot to mention earlier that the DTI is only one, or the Department of Trade and Industry in the Philippines is only one among the several national government agencies that are in charge of addressing the concerns on climate change as well as protecting the environment. And so question is, what have we done so far as government? What has the Department of Trade and Industry done so far? The very first, since we were exposed in this advocacy for the Consumer Protection Group in the Department of Trade and Industry, we attended a workshop here in Japan together with the members of the ASEAN Committee on Consumer Protection. And that was the first time that we met Dr. Nakahara. We were taught, our eyes were opened on sustainable consumption and production. It was actually a proposal of the Philippines to the ACCP to make a toolkit or a guide or like a book, a guidebook that will teach all of us, consumers, educators, the academe, government organizations, private citizens, private corporations, that we can all use and refer to this toolkit in our daily consumption behavior or in educating consumers. And we are very happy, I'm very happy to mention that one of the regional consultants that completed the toolkit is here in the room. I'd like to recognize Dr. Satita Wimon Kunarat. Oh, and thank you. Oh, yes, thank you very much. She was one of the 3 regional consultants that we had, and we had the UNCTAD as well as international consultants. This project was a collaboration project between the ACCP, the ASEAN Secretariat, and of course the Japan-ASEAN Integration Fund. It was funded by JAIF actually, and the completion went really well from 2019 up to 2020. So it's now posted in the ASEAN website. For your information, you can, of course, we're all going digital now. It's like a 200-page document that you can make reference to. You can just visit the ACCP website, and it's going to be there. It's called the ASEAN Sustainable Consumption Toolkit. And so another initiative that we had is the Consumer Youth E-Forum. Beginning in 2020, when the Philippines went on lockdown, we had to continue our advocacy, and we had to continue our work in the Consumer Protection Group. So we came up with a Consumer E-Youth Forum. This is purely digital, it's purely virtual, and we have done this in collaboration with the National Youth Commission, so that we will have all the youth in the country, including universities and colleges, whether public or private, were invited to join the E-Forum. And so far, we have conducted this for the 6th time already in 2022. We also have the Sustainability Solutions Exchange. This was an initiative of the Center for International Trade Expositions and Missions, or CITEM. It is an attached agency of the Department of Trade and Industry. And the Sustainable Solutions Exchange was done to promote sustainable practices, resources, and technology in the world's essential industries. So we were able to finish this in 2021 as well. And for the youth specifically, we also have other programs that they would get actively involved and be with us in advocating for sustainable consumption and production. In the Philippines, we have also, the Department of Trade and Industry has a regular consumer program aired on national TV and national radio. So it would be easy to access the consumers. We call it Consumer at iba pa. It means consumer and others, or consumer, etc. And we always discuss or make discussions on sustainable consumption and production so that we can reach more people. We will have a wider range of audience. And then we have the Climate Science Youth Program. This one is a project of the Climate Change Commission. Like I mentioned earlier, there are several national government agencies in the Philippines addressing or who are in charge of addressing climate change and environmental protection. And so the CCC, or the Climate Change Commission, spearheaded the Gawad CCC search for outstanding young climate scientists. Incidentally, I'd like to also mention that in the Philippines, we celebrated October as the Consumer Welfare Month. Oh, it's still October now. So October in the Philippines is Consumer Welfare Month. And as part of our activities during the whole month, we also had a video making contest involving the youth on their practices of sustainable consumption and production. Awarding has not yet been done, but we have around 30 entries from all consumers, youth consumers nationwide. Also, as part of the Consumer Welfare Month, we also had, as a culminating activity, Consumer Congress. This is the third or fourth year that we have been doing the Consumer Congress as culminating activity for the Consumer Welfare Month. And our theme for this year is digital consumerism, sustainable consumerism in the digital age. We have Trash to Cashback program, where participants are allowed to exchange and convert recyclable wastes to points as well, so that they can use this for groceries or other goods or even services that they consume. And then the migration of 3 environmental education modules. We have private companies as well assisting government. As a matter of fact, Coca-Cola in the Philippines also partnered with the Department of Trade and Industry and is continuing to do the Teach for the Philippines program. It's an organization that works to ensure that all Filipino children can benefit from an inclusive, relevant, and excellent education. We have been talking about education a lot, and we have been discussing how we can make sure that consumers are correctly informed. Well, I'd like to mention that one of the consumer rights is a consumer right to information, but in the Philippines, we do not just say information. Our consumers are entitled to the correct information. So discussions earlier on how the consumer would know if the product is really sustainable or is falsely tagged as sustainable. That is part of the consumer information that the consumers have the right to. There is also a group that's called Common Home on Toxics and Free Schools program. They do this, they collaborate with universities and colleges in the Philippines. And this one particularly is in collaboration with La Consolacion University. It's a webinar on environmental protection, promoting best practices and toxic waste information, because we want the schools in the Philippines to be toxic waste free. On this slide, you will see Camp Kalikasan. It's a digital resource center designed by the World Wide Fund for Nature. We did this recently. It's also in collaboration with Globe, one of the largest telephone communications company in the Philippines. And this is also to increase consumer awareness, especially targeting the youth. Museum of Nature, or Nature Museum, Museo Kalikasan, that's in the vernacular. It was also launched by Epson and the WWF, that aims to make the learning and discovery of the current state of the planet a fun, easy to digest, and interactive experience for all. So this is open for all the youth in the Philippines. They can always register, have themselves registered, and join the programs. It tackles climate change, single plastic pollution, and other things that involve the environment. Okay, so these are the gaps and challenges that we have in the Philippines. Policy, we already have all the laws. All the laws that we need are there, except I think the price tag, of course, is a must in the Philippines. It is mandated by law. But maybe this time we can also mandate the tag on sustainability of the product or an eco-labeling, which we can make mandatory. Some of the policies as well are not implemented, maybe because they are so old already that the new leaders in government forget. But of course, we will also have to look into these laws. Advocacy, like I said earlier, consumer protection is a shared right. And consumer empowerment, consumer advocacy, consumer education, while it is provided by government, should also be welcomed by consumers. They should also take interest and learn from what government is saying, because no matter how many times we conduct the consumer care webinar series that we have, if consumers are not interested, or if consumers refuse to understand or even refuse to listen, then all our exercises will be inutile. So we need to increase awareness and understanding of sustainable consumption. While it still remains a jargon in the Philippines, sustainable consumption is still a jargon in the Philippines. Not many people really understand. That's why every time we do advocacy programs, we have to explain and define what sustainability is. Because while they hear us, they are probably not interested, or probably they just refuse to understand. So we need to do some more of this. We also need to make ourselves accessible, or maybe more accessible to the public. Changing consumer youth behavior is also very important. You would note that in one of the presentations earlier, it said that, I think it was Gordon's, there will be more youth who are aware of sustainable consumption and production in the future than we are now. Yes, I believe this is true because the youth are more interested, the youth are more open in sustainable consumption and production, and you would see a lot of young people also in the Philippines promoting and actually practicing sustainable consumption and production. It is not just promotion, it's not just an advocacy, it's not just teaching or conducting educational programs that is important. It is also the practice of sustainable consumption and production that is equally important, or probably even more important than educating them. Also in the Philippines, I'd like to mention that we have made efforts already to include sustainable consumption and production in the regular grade school curriculum. Our eyes were opened before in 2019 by the workshop that we did here in Japan, and since then we have been lobbying with the Department of Education to include this in the curriculum, and so far they are studying it and looking into ways, or looking where they can include it in the grade school curriculum. We would want to teach young children, maybe as young as 3 or 4 years old, so that when they grow up, it's going to be their lifestyle, the view that they have grown up with, so that they can practice in the real sense of the word sustainable consumption and production. And finally, market participation, commitment of business. We have also been engaging with our private stakeholders, but of course, it takes a while to convince them to convert to sustainable consumption and production. To change the behavior of their production will have to take a while, and they will have to do a lot of things. So while they agree that we need to shift to sustainable production, it takes a lot of effort as well on the business side before they can finally become truly sustainable. Moving forward, these are our steps forward: integration of consumer protection and sustainable consumption and production in the Philippine grade school curriculum. And we have been working on this, and the intention is to change mindsets, or to create mindsets, and to create demand as well, because we see a lot of sustainable products out there in the market, and yes, they are expensive, they can be quite expensive, but if we instill in the minds of consumers that this is the way to go, that this is what we really should do, and then we will be creating demand. And probably, if a lot more producers produce sustainably, then maybe they can bring down the prices and make it more affordable to the sustainable consumers. And finally, we do more partnerships, and we have to strengthen our partnerships with other consumer organizations, as well as the academe, business, and other relevant sectors. And so that is all from the Philippines. Maraming salamat po. Mabuhay.
どうもロスさんありがとうございました。彼女は弁護士でもあるわけなんですけれども、ASEAN の中で、リーダー格としてですね、消費者保護政策の作成に、携わっております。で、今発表になった大きなポイントっていうのは、やはりこれまでの発表者が強調しておりました、テイクアクション、どうやって行動するのか、その時の行動に導く、もしくは、サステナブルなその選択がちゃんとなされているかどうか、実際は違うねっていう話、まさにギャップと課題の問題について、きちっと政府の側がですね、認識をした上で政策を作っているという点が、大変新鮮に思われました。それでは、4人の方々がわっと発表なさったんですけれども、特別ゲストコメンテーターとしてエシカル精神教育会の会長である生駒さんに来ていただいております。コメントよろしくお願いします。
はい、それでは今私4人の皆様のレクチャーをお伺いしまして、本当に示唆に満ちた未来につながるお話をお伺いできましたが、少しずつコメントをさせていただきたいと思います。まずロブ・ハリスンさん、エシカルコンシューマーの代表でいらっしゃいます。 Z 世代とエシカル消費ということで今お話をお伺いしたんですが、最終結論的にですね、30歳以下、Z 世代ですね、主には 61% の方々がより良い未来があるだろうと考えているというのは素晴らしい、これは数字だと思いました。どちらかというとですね、否定的に考えがちじゃないですか。今この環境の中で未来に対してこの地球は大丈夫だろうかと考えがちなところですが、テイクアクション、まさに行動を変えていくことで未来は作れる、明るい未来が作れるという、そういう希望を持っている世代が Z 世代だということをお聞きしてですね、非常に頼もしく思いました。まず生活様式を変えたいと思っている Z 世代が圧倒的に多いということですね。ただ、物価の高騰もありますので、なかなか行動に結びつきにくい。しかし食生活の変化は著しいと聞きました。ヴィーガニズムですね。日本でもヴィーガン浸透しつつあります。そして、DX がですね、そういった行動を後押しできるのではないかというお話もありました。また学校教育の重要性ですね。そういったことがある反面、DX デジタルトランスフォーメーションの危険性も謳われました。そういったところで我々いろいろ学びながら検証しながらデジタルと、このグリーントランスフォーメーションですね、エシカルトランスフォーメーションの協調ですね、共同ですね、ハーモニーを考えていかなければいけないという、そういうご意見でした。ただ非常にその Z 世代がですね、行動をすぐ起こす、これ日本でも同じだと思います。理念で考えがちなそのエシカルという、あるいは環境問題であったり人権問題ですが、日本でも10代20代の若い方々はですね、すぐ行動に起こす、そしてイノベーター起業家もたくさん出てきてます。社会課題解決の起業家が日本でも今どんどん生まれてきていますので、そういった道筋が見えたお話でした。ありがとうございます。それからゴードン・ルノフさん、エシカルショッピングのアプリグドンニュー、実は日本でもじわじわすごく人気がありまして、私の周りもサステナブルファッション取り組んでいる方多いんですけど、ルノフさん来るのみたいなお話を聞いております。でそのルノフさんからはですね、消費者の 50% 以上が持続可能な買い物をしたいと思っているという、この数字また大きいですよね。 で同時に、消費者には責任ある選択をする権利がある。これ権利でもあり責任でもあると言えるでしょうか。そこでグドンニューを立ち上げられて、エマ・ワトソンというような非常に社会的影響力のある方もですね、コラボレートされて、サステナブルな活動をしている、あるいはものづくりをしているブランドを支援する、後押しする、あるいは、またいろんなブランドに対してですね、アドバイスですとか、評論も行っていくというアプリとなっています。ブランドの50%、主張の 50% に証拠がないんだと、グリーンウォッシュじゃないかという指摘もありました。グリーンウォッシュ、実は昨日 NHK でも特集が組まれまして、中原先生が監修をされたんですけど、日本ではまだまだ話題になり始めたところですね。皆が学んでいる途中かと思いますけれども、消費者のエンパワー、消費者の力がですね、社会をより良くしていくんだ、そのためのアプリの開発ということで、先頭を切っていらっしゃるルノフさんのお話、たくさんインスピレーションいただきました。またエリス・ジョーンズさんはアメリカのベターワールドショッパーの代表でいらっしゃるんですけど、本当にお話が全部未来につながっていて刺激的でした。デジタルグローバル市民という考え方ですね。グローバル市民という言葉からさらに発展しています。そして、5つの共通価値ということで、人権、環境、動物福祉、地域社会への関与、社会正義、これはどちらの国でも今取り組んでいることだと思うんですが、アプリでですね、持続可能な企業を支援していこうという、これはグドンニューと同じ共通する考え方だと思うんですが、そこからさらにですね、政治家の評価アプリですとか、ニュースソースの評価アプリ、メディアですね、そこまでですねご提案されていたのは本当に刺激を受けました。まだ日本にはそこまでの、アプリは出てきていないと思います。持続可能性レーティング制度ですね。もっと分かりやすく消費者がエシカル消費を可能にするようなですね、レーティング制度っていうのは本当に有効だなというふうに今回は思いました。いかにそれがですね実現していけるかをちょっと今頭の中でぐるぐる忙しく考えているところです。世界レベル、国レベル、個人レベル、それから州や市のレベル、もう本当にいろんなレベルでですね、つながって、共に考えていかなければいけないイシューをいただいたなと思っております。そして最後にルースさんですね、フィリピンの貿易産業省の事務次官であり、ASEAN のリーダー格でいらっしゃるということで、本当にそのアジアを束ねていらっしゃるアジアのエシカル消費、エシカルアクションのリーダーでいらっしゃるんですが、本当に多様なですね取り組みをされているなと思いました。しかもですね、政府の中にいらっしゃるんですけれども、本当に開かれた環境を作ってらっしゃるなと思いましたのは、市民団体ですとか教育機関ですとか学術会ですとか、さらにはデジタルですね、あと若い世代とつながって、壁を乗り越えてですね、エシカルあるいはサステナビリティの推進に、熱を注いでいらっしゃるということをお伺いして、本当に熱い情熱的なお言葉を聞けたと思っております。とりわけですね、若いジェネレーションを巻き込んでの意見交換をすごく大切にしたいんだっていうふうにおっしゃってたことは、これ日本でも今私たちが盛んに言っていることです。今日皆様に4人の講師の方々に共通しておりますのが、やはり Z 世代、これからの未来を作る世代の人たちとどうつながってですね、彼らと一緒に前に進んでいくかっていうことが一つの大きなテーマかなと感じました。あとデジタルですね。デジタルをですね、活用しながらもちゃんとですね検証しながら、より良いデジタルとの協業、あるいはデジタル金融をですね私たちが発明していかなければいけない時代なのかなというふうに思っております。私は現在日本エシカル推進協議会という エシカルの専門家の集まりの会長に3代目に中原会長から今名誉会長になられましたが引き継いでおります。でどんどん今このエシカルを世に広めることを目標としております。私はメディア出身なんですね。ファッション雑誌をずっと編集してきておりまして、エシカルファッションをずっと追求している立場ですので、メディアの力でどんどんエシカルをこの社会に広めて定着させていくことをしていきたいなと考えています。実は今週金曜日に私どもの協議会のエシカルサミットを開催するんですが、その中でもご紹介するんですけども、日本ではエシカルのアクションは地方から非常に盛んに起こってきてるんですね。実はこの徳島がいい例なんですけども、他に鳥取県ですとか名古屋ですとか愛知県ですとか、フェアトレードタウン宣言も盛んに行われておりますし、エシカル宣言も愛知で最近されました。むしろですね、本当に地方からの熱い熱をね、の後押しを受けて、政府も動き始めております。今日は消費者庁の長官お見えくださいましたが、消費者庁はもう本当にエシカル消費で先頭を切ってくださって、エシカル消費の推進と、あとエシカルファッションサポーター制度というのも作って、推進していこう。さらには消費者志向経営ですね。消費者にとって有益な活動をしている企業を後押しする、そういう制度も表彰制度も設けられています。また環境省もですね、気候変動に対するさまざまなアクションを取ると同時にサステナブルファッション実は後押ししておりまして、大きな力になっています。また農水省では、有機農業の推進ですとか動物福祉をちゃんと問題として捉えて進めていくようなこと、そして経済産業省でもですね、この8月から人権問題ですね、人権デューデリエンスの取り組みが本格的に始まりまして、主に繊維産業の中での労働環境の見直しというのが始まっています。また東京都もですね、エシカルアクションを推進するプロジェクト始まっています。そういったことをちょっと金曜日のサミットではご報告できればと思ってますが、日本でもそういう意味で政府から、地方自治ですね、地方の行政、それから教育機関、そしてメディア、それから市民団体 NPO や NGO、それから学術会ですね、つながってこのエシカルの流れを未来につなげる大きなアクションが今起こってきているところですので、そんなタイミングでこの4人の講師の方々をお迎えできたことは非常に私記念すべきことであり象徴的なことだと思います。これから、我々に必要なのはグローバルなですね、ダイアログを持続的に行っていくことかなと思っています。対話の必要性をすごく感じます。今日機会にですね、ぜひグローバルにつながっていくダイアログをこの日本からもつなげて発信していければと感じました。以上です。ありがとうございました。
どうもありがとうございました。なんとなくまとめそうな雰囲気でコメントをいただいたんですけれども、実はこの時間ファリッド・エーカーがですね、ジョージアから連絡取れないもんでその分使っちゃおうということで、制限はしませんでした。しかし3年ぶりで皆さんリアルで会ってるためにですね、いろんな思いでお話しされたと、これは止める意味がないだろうと思っております。で、一つ私の方からですね、問題提起をしたいっていうか、この DX というデジタル革命がですね、本当に私たちの暮らしに役に立つものなのか、それともひょっとするとですね、将来のことを考えると落とし穴みたいなものが待ち受けているのか、ここはやっぱり冷静に判断する、まさに消費者教育の分野でいうと、批判的にものをきちっと考えて判断するっていう意思決定の力を私たちが持ちうるかどうかということにも関わってくるんだろうと思います。で、そういう中で落とし穴になりそうな問題が今全員の発表の中からありましたグリーンウォッシュの問題だと思います。まさに持続可能な選択が妨げるものがグリーンウォッシュじゃないかということで、これ長い間研究してます エリスさんにまずその辺に対する考え方を、簡単にお願いしたいと思います。
This is an excellent question, and I think it's a really important one. So I think to answer it, we need to think about three things: the short-term answer, the medium-term, and the long-term. In the short term, I think that one of the only effective ways to navigate around greenwashing is, as I mentioned before, these sustainable rating systems. They're comprehensive, they're easily made into practical data that consumers can make sense of, and they help really avoid the greenwashing problem. So in the short term, I think for Generation Z, and now I'm speaking maybe particularly all over the world, but particularly to Generation Z in Japan, without your own rating system, I think the best opportunity would be to combine the rating systems that exist out there now. So take all of the grades that are out there, put them together into a single starting point. This can be done very quickly. In fact, my own students have done this as a project of theirs, and they turned this into an app. It's not available on iPhones, it's only for Android phones, called Eco Report Card. And they just find all of the data and put it together and create a sort of universal grade. And that, in the short term, I think is a very effective starting point for avoiding greenwashing. And it's one that Generation Z is equipped to do because of their digital savvy. In the medium term, I really think that Generation Z is the best generation equipped to establish a rating system in Japan for sustainability ratings. And it must be tailored to what people want and need in this country. I don't know what that will look like. It will obviously not have A through F. It might not have 0 to 100. It could be anything. I put together, a possibility which is based on Amazon rating systems, which I know are much more universal, 1 to 5 stars. And in this case, it would be sustainability stars. So 5 stars for sustainable leaders or businesses that are on the cutting edge, 4 stars for those in the advanced stages of sustainable practices, 3 stars for sustainability records that are solid, 2 stars for those that are early stages, and 1 star for those that have not yet started in earnest sustainability efforts. And finally, some kind of a rating for just companies that we have no data around, so we don't know what their sustainability record looks like. I think a system like this could be easily created by Generation Z in 30 days if they wanted to create something that was immediately useful and practical. And within a year, I think that system could be polished and implemented and available nationwide. And if there is any interest in this, I am happy to offer my own experience on creating rating systems to help. In the long term, however, I think it's very important for Generation Z to take this a step further, and they know how to do it so much better than we do. It's important not just to have a system in place that people can access from anywhere on their phones, but to go beyond just having a smartphone app, to have, for example, engaging online posts, communities online, on Instagram, on Twitter, on Facebook, that are posting on a regular basis about these issues. Also to have active channels on YouTube, to be, again, creating content that people can engage with, that they're used to through the channels that they're used to. There could be regular podcasts that are audio or video podcasts on Google or Apple podcast platforms, or Audible, Spotify, these kind of video and radio shows that allow people to access this information in another way. Having said all of that, I do think it would be an error to avoid traditional print media. There is something about having the physical form of a book, the physicality of a business card, pamphlets, these things create some other aspect that you can then pass around in the physical world that then supplement all of the digital possibilities. And the other thing to note is that as Generation Z creates their own landscape for ethical consumption, they will have their own creative media forms that are not listed up here. And it's important for them to add that creative form, to add their own creativity to this process, because it is their project, right? It must work for them. And so, not being from Generation Z, I can give a bit of advice, but ultimately, I look forward to seeing their creativity in the long term to make navigating greenwashing effective and possible.
はい、大変いい短期的、そして中期的、長期的、何ができるのか。で、まさにエリスさんが先ほどの発表の中でおっしゃってた、いわゆるそのグローバルシティズンシップの対応できるようなやり方だと伺いました。で、DX をこわもの扱いするんではなく、今の若い人たちっていうのはそれをもう縦横無尽に使えるような世代なんですね。逆に落とし穴もいいんだろうということで、そのための指標作りというものが非常にアマゾンの話出しましたけど、私はミシュランの、星印を思い出したんですけども、それと同じような先ほど成績法ね、ABCDEF という感じの成績もあるし、それぞれの国で馴染みやすいような一つの表現で Z 世代が理解していく、そういうのを見つけることが大事だと思うんですけど、そこで、もう時間が迫っておりますけれども、ロブさん最後にお願いしたいのは、エシカルコンシューマーの中でこういうさまざまなそのウォッシングが行われているぞという特集をですねおやりになったと思いますけれども、そういう中から我々消費者が気をつけなきゃいけないグリーンウォッシングの例について簡単にご説明を、無理かもしれませんけどお願いできますでしょうか。
So greenwashing, people are using the word in two ways now. When it was originally used, it meant covering up something bad by pretending to do something good. So, I'm an oil company who has made a field of solar panels, and I will put that on the newspaper. So it was about covering something up, but now the language is almost meaning just not telling the truth about your product. So it's interesting to see how the language has changed a little bit, but that's fine. And in a sense, it's the word greenwashing is really, really useful, and it's part of society learning how to discuss ethical consumption, because we need that word in order to be able to identify what the problem is and to be able to solve it. And so this is people beginning to solve it. You probably haven't got time for an example, so I won't give an example, but I would say that the solution of ranking might be good, but I think it could be more complicated than that. But ultimately, it's about society being able to have a discussion. What is ethical and what is not always fixed. It's quite fluid. We learn new things about what is sustainable and what isn't. Science comes up with new ideas, and so. Greenwashing, the word greenwashing helps us to have that conversation in a way that will help us to identify the risk, which is that companies, they like to overstate how good they are and not how bad they are. We know that already, but it helps us identify it very specifically in the area of making claims around sustainability, which is super important. And I would just finish on saying that we know that governments are beginning to regulate greenwashing, particularly in the West. We now have very specific laws now about greenwashing that people are beginning to implement. And I noticed that this afternoon there is a session on the legal framework around sustainable consumption. I know that one of your speakers, because I met them at breakfast, is going to talk about greenwashing in a legal context here.
はい、どうもありがとうございました。実は時間があればですね、ここでその合同さんとですね、生駒さんに、2人にそのファッションにおけるグリーンウォッシングの話をしてもらう予定だったので、この続きは申し訳ございません。さっき宣伝をされてました、エシカルサミット10月の28日にエシカル推進協議会が開くそうですので、そこで、お楽しみの時間は延ばしていただくということで割愛させていただきます。大変短い時間ではありましたけれども、3年ぶりにようやく私たちは顔を合わせることができました。で、その思いがあって、もう時間は関係ないねと、ジョージアにいるファリードの時間まで使ってですね、ギリギリいっぱい議論させていただきました。これから先、やっぱり我々は何をすべきなのか、その時にいい言葉が見つかりました。デジタルなグローバルシチズンシップの時代が来てるのかもしれない。そうした時にそれを妨げるものは何なのかということも絶えず考えていくことが必要だというご提案をいただいたと思います。こういう機会を与えていただいた徳島県、そして、今日ご参加の皆さんの、表情を見てますと、満足のいく時間を過ごせたんじゃないかなと思ってます。改めて、今日ご参集いただいた、海外からのスピーカーに対して盛大な拍手をお願いして閉じたいと思います。
中原様、生駒様、そしてパネリストの皆様、ありがとうございました。今年は全員とはいきませんでしたが、海外の皆様にこの会場にお越しいただけたことを大変嬉しく思っております。とても素晴らしいセッションをご展開いただきました。もう一度皆様、盛大な拍手をお願いいたします。ありがとうございました。
中原先生、すいません。あれ？ルースさんがどうしてもちょっと重要なことをお伝えしたいっておっしゃってるんですけど。
どうぞ。
Is it okay? Yes. Is it okay? Thank you. Thank you. I just need to address the issue of greenwashing coming from the point of view of government. Greenwashing, we are all consumers. We are greenwashed by manufacturers and other businesses. In that case, we are deceived. And so that becomes a crime. We are all consumers. We have the right to correct information. These businesses also have the responsibility to provide us the correct information. So if there is greenwashing, it should be then a crime. In the Philippines, it's in the Consumer Act. I'm sure all of you, all countries around the world would have consumer laws. It's under a deceptive, unfair, and unconscionable sales act or practice on the part of business. It's also in the revised penal code. There's misrepresentation, so there is swindling. There is a concomitant penalty for that. So consumers need not be deceived or should not be deceived by greenwashing. Governments should do something about it and make sure that greenwashers or the businesses that do greenwashing be penalized and be stopped from doing it. Thank you. I just needed to say that. I'm sorry.
はい、どうもありがとうございます。今のルースの言葉はですね、長官も聞いていただいていると思いますので、行政が果たす役割、政府が果たす役割っていうのはあるんだろうと、最近、ね、三菱電機であるとかですね、日野自動車、日本を代表する企業がまだまだそんなことをやってるっていう、これはまさに消費者教育、もしくは消費者の育成をですね、妨げるもの以外ないんだろうという思いがあります。そういうふうにしてしまった社会は一体何なんだろうかということも、皆さんもぜひお考えいただいて、より良い社会のために今日の話をですね、 生かしていただければと思います。ルーさん、ごめんなさい。大事な話を最後にすっ飛ばしましたけれども、良かったと思います。じゃあ、これでこのフォーラムを終わりたいと思います。どうもありがとうございました。